G'day you gorgeous people and welcome back to Politics Made OK. Now 2021 was a defining year for women in politics. Parliament House was not immune to the Me Too movement, and with Brittany Higgins coming out about her alleged sexual assault, which prompted the Jenkins report and all kinds of other stuff, there's hope on the horizon that things could be a-changin'. But who are the women in Australian politics? Who was the first one? And who should you be watching for now? I'm going to answer all those questions for you and give you some insight on which women you should be looking out for ahead of the next federal election. It's all coming up on another show with PMO. Australia was actually one of the early movers when it came to women's right to vote and to run for parliament. While we gave white women the right to vote in 1902, it took the UK like 15 years longer. In the US, it took almost another 20 years. In France, another 40 years. And the place I was born, Switzerland, didn't give women the right to vote until 1971. And people wonder why I don't speak more about my heritage. But we're actually beaten out by our New Zealand cousins who gave women the right to vote in like 1893. It's important to note though, Australia didn't let First Nations women, or men, vote until the 1960s. So in 1902, some women can vote in Australia. And while there was this big gap in other Western countries between letting women vote and letting women run for parliament, in Australia we just did both of those things at once. And in the following year, 4 female candidates ran in the federal election. None of them actually got in though, and it would take another 20 years before a woman was actually voted into any parliament in Australia. And the woman that did that for the first time was Edith Cowan. She was voted into WA's Legislative Assembly in 1921. She probably does look familiar for those of you that carry pineapples in your wallet. I'm not one of those people. At the time of being voted in, there was an interesting response to her entering Parliament. But she would go down in history. I mean, a federal seat would be named after her, Cowan, and there'd be a university named after her in Perth as well. Still, it would take another 20 years for women to be elected into the federal Parliament. Enid Lyons became a member for the House of Representatives in 1943, and Dorothy Tangi became a senator in 1944. Funnily enough, it took 30 years after that to install a female bathroom in Parliament House. Because we all know ladies don't pee or poo. Oh heavens, just the thought of it. And there were plenty of huge firsts still to come for women in Parliament. Liberal politician Margaret Guilfoyle would become the first ever female minister in the 1970s. She was followed by Susan Ryan, who was Labor's first ever female minister in the 1980s. And during Susan Ryan's time in Parliament, she'd go on to pass the milestone Sex Discrimination Act. The huge moment for women in politics, of course, came when Julia Gillard was voted in as Australia's first ever female PM. What a moment, right? Like our own Jacinda Ardern. Except she was spoken of and treated really different to Ardern, who we all fawn over. Yeah, not exactly a shining example of Australia's attitudes towards women. Here's hoping we've at least learned what not to do next time we get a female PM. But let's fast forward to the present day. Today, about 30% of the House of Representatives are female, and about 50% of the Senate are female. So, who are some of the most important female figures in Parliament that you need to know about? Well, there's the 2 longest serving women in Parliament. The first one is Marise Payne, who's a New South Wales Senator and the Minister for Foreign Affairs and for Women. She came into Parliament in 1997. And then there's Tanya Plibersek, who's the Shadow Education Minister and came into Parliament in 1998. These are the 2 most senior women of their respective parties. They have decades of experience, have held numerous portfolios, and are just definitely big movers and shakers. And in Tanya Plibersek's case, the question of if she'd ever become Labor Party leader has come up a lot. In other words, remember their names. Another veteran politician to remember is Penny Wong, who was voted in as a South Australian Senator in 2002. She was the first openly gay person in Parliament, she's a really big power broker, and she's Labor's leader in the Senate. She's not scared at all about calling the government out and really has this quiet rage about her that is terrifying.
Are you saying they're on schedule in WA?
At this point, Senator.
Really?
Other women you need to know about are Linda Burney, who was the first Aboriginal woman to be voted into Parliament in 2016. She's the Labor Party's Shadow Minister for Indigenous Affairs, and it goes without saying she's a huge voice in the space on issues facing First Nations people. And given that all of those issues are going to remain so central to Australian policymakers for years to come, she's definitely someone to watch. Another Labor MP I think is going to make a difference is WA's Anne Arley. Funnily enough, she holds the seat of Cowan. She was the first Muslim woman to be voted into Parliament in 2016, and she's also a really renowned academic and writer on things like counter-terrorism. Again, I'm talking about a really big issue here. I mean, people being attracted to the fringes of society and, yeah, even being radicalised, it's something that's happening more and more. And so figuring out how to stop that and how to de-radicalise people is only going to become more important. And Anne could definitely play a big role in that. The last Labor parliamentarian you need to know about is Christina Keneally. Now, you might have heard of this name before. Christina Keneally actually was a New South Wales Premier. She was also recently parachuted in to run for the New South Wales seat of Fowler by the Labor Party. And that was because there was this local female Vietnamese lawyer who was already a Labor candidate. The thing that you need to know is that this move will see Christina Keneally go from the Senate to the House of Representatives. And that opens up the opportunity for her to run for party leadership. That's not the key reason she's running for that seat, but it is a convenient bonus that will have us all raising our eyebrows over what she's going to do next. Now, moving on to the Liberal side, something really interesting happened this year. So it's no secret that the treatment of women has been a big issue for the government to tackle in 2021. In response to all those scandals, Scott Morrison announced this Women's Taskforce in March. Basically, it promoted some women and gave them more responsibilities. Like Jane Hume, who got the portfolio of Women's Economic Security, and Amanda Stoker, who was given the role of Assistant Minister for Women. And then the task force brought together all the serving female ministers and assistant ministers into this group of 9 that were going to tackle issues facing Australian women.
The changes I'm announcing today will once again provide the strongest ever female representation in an Australian government cabinet. But it's not just about the size of the female contingent in my cabinet, but it's the skills and the experience, it's the perspective.
Now, if the coalition is voted back into government, these women will have portfolios and positions of power. Because unless something ridiculous happens, Scott Morrison is not going to be demoting any of them after a speech like that. So there you have it, 100 years of women serving in Parliament across Australia. From the first woman to ever hold a parliamentary position, to 9 women now holding positions in the government's ministry. Our first female Prime Minister has been and gone, that's true. But we may have our next one soon enough. And now you know who to look out for. Let me know about what you think, and if you have any other questions about some of the women I've mentioned, in the comments below. And as always, don't forget to like and subscribe so that you don't miss a single episode of the show that breaks down everything happening on the Hill, Politics Made OK.